Everything can look completely fine on the surface and still feel like it's coming apart underneath. That's the part nobody warns you about. You're not in crisis, nothing's collapsed. On paper, your life is intact. The job, the relationship, the routine you spent years building. And yet something in you has gone strangely quiet, like a radio station you've listened to your whole life slowly dissolving into static, and you can't tell whether you're losing the signal or whether a new one is trying to break through. Carl Jung spent his career sitting across from people caught in exactly that moment. They'd come to him convinced something had gone wrong with them. They felt restless, hollow, disconnected from lives that used to fit. Their families thought they were breaking down, and Jung, watching closely, kept noticing that these people weren't unraveling at all. They were being retuned. Something deeper in them was reaching for a frequency their old life couldn't carry. He came to believe the psyche sends signals before it changes course. Not loud ones. Small disturbances in the familiar, quiet symptoms that look like problems but are actually announcements. And most people misread them completely. They medicate the restlessness, distract themselves from the emptiness, and rush back toward whatever feels normal, never realizing they were standing at the edge of the most important transformation of their lives. Today, I'm going to walk you through the 8 signs Jung identified that appear right before a life shifts for good, why each one feels like something's wrong when it's actually something opening, and what it means if you recognize more than a few of them in yourself right now. Because if you do, you're not falling apart. You're being tuned to a station you haven't heard yet. Before we get to the signs, you need to understand what Jung meant when he talked about this kind of change. He called the larger process individuation, the slow movement toward becoming who you actually are, rather than who you were shaped to be. And he noticed it almost never begins with clarity. It begins with disturbance. The unconscious, that vast part of you operating below your awareness, starts pressing against the walls of the identity you've been living inside. And that pressure shows up as symptoms long before it shows up as insight. The first sign is that the things that used to matter to you go quiet. You wake up one morning and the goals that drove you for years feel oddly distant, like photographs of someone else's ambitions. The career milestone you were chasing loses its pull. The hobbies that lit you up feel like obligations. Even good things, a promotion, a compliment, a plan you'd have been thrilled about a year ago, land softly, muffled, as if you're hearing them through a wall. This isn't depression in the way people usually mean it, though it can be mistaken for it. There's no heavy sadness attached, just a strange thinning of meaning. The colors have drained out of a life that used to feel saturated. And because nothing is technically wrong, you can't explain it to anyone, which makes it lonelier than an actual problem would be. Jung understood this hollowing out as the psyche withdrawing its energy from structures that have finished their work. When a part of your life has served its purpose in your development, the life force that once flowed into it starts pulling back, the way sap retreats from a branch before it drops. The energy isn't gone, it's being redirected, pooling somewhere deeper, gathering to fuel something you can't see yet. The mistake most people make here is trying to force the feeling back. They double down on the goals that stopped mattering, chase harder, add more, convinced that the emptiness means they're not trying enough. But you can't manufacture meaning that's already migrated. The quiet isn't a malfunction to fix. It's a message. The old station is fading because something in you is done listening to it. The second sign is a pull toward solitude that the people around you don't understand. You start canceling plans you'd normally keep. Social gatherings that used to energize you begin to drain something essential, and you can't quite name what. It's not that you've stopped loving your friends. It's that being around people now requires you to perform a version of yourself that's becoming harder and harder to sustain. And after every interaction, you feel like you've spent currency you can't afford to lose. So you find reasons to be alone. You take the long way home. You sit in your car in the driveway a few extra minutes before going inside. You crave a kind of silence that feels almost physical, like your nervous system is asking for a room with no other voices in it. And the people who love you start to worry, because from the outside, this looks like withdrawal, like something's wrong. Jung saw this differently. he recognized that transformation demands enormous internal resources, and the psyche begins conserving energy the way a body does during illness, by pulling back from the outer world to fund the work happening within. Your need for solitude during this period is as legitimate as the need for sleep. Something inside you is being rebuilt, and that construction can't happen while you're pouring yourself out to everyone else. The tragedy is how often this gets pathologized. Family members push you to socialize, to snap out of it, to be your old self again. And the pressure to keep performing the person you're outgrowing can trap you in a life you've already started to leave. The pull towards solitude isn't you shutting down, it's you making room. The third sign is that your inner world suddenly gets loud. Your dreams intensify. You start having vivid, strange, emotionally charged dreams that feel significant even when they make no logical sense. Dreams you remember for days, that seem to be pointing at something just out of reach. Memories surface that you haven't thought about in decades. Random images from childhood, faces you'd forgotten, feelings that arrive from nowhere and leave you sitting in your kitchen wondering why your chest is tight. This is the unconscious making its move. When the grip of your old identity loosens, when the persona you've maintained starts losing its hold, everything you tucked away underneath it begins to rise. Every feeling you didn't have time for, every part of yourself you set aside to fit the life you built. Jung believed the psyche stores all of it, compressed and waiting, and when the structure holding it down starts to crack, the pressure behind it releases upward into consciousness. It can feel overwhelming, even frightening, because material that's been buried for years doesn't come up gently. You might cry without knowing why. You might feel waves of anger at things long past. Old wounds you were sure you'd healed start aching again, as though they'd only been sleeping. Jung would tell you none of this means you're regressing. The eruption is the psyche doing housekeeping it couldn't do while you were busy holding everything together. It's bringing the buried material into the light so it can finally be integrated instead of carried. The noise in your inner world is the sound of things that were locked away being set free. The fourth sign is that you can no longer wear the mask that used to fit. There's a version of yourself you've presented to the world for years. Competent, agreeable, put together, whatever your particular performance happened to be. Jung called this the persona, the socially acceptable face we construct to move through life. And for most of your life, that mask has felt almost indistinguishable from your actual face. You forgot you were wearing it. Then, at the threshold of a shift, the mask stops staying on. You catch yourself unable to fake enthusiasm you don't feel. You hear yourself saying honest things in situations that used to call for polite performance, and part of you is shocked at how the truth just slid out. Small talk becomes almost physically difficult. Pretending to be fine when you're not starts to feel like swallowing something sharp. What's happening is that the distance between who you appear to be and who you actually are has widened past the point where you can hold both together. Maintaining the persona used to cost you a little energy. Now it costs you more than you have, and so the mask slips, sometimes at inconvenient moments, revealing something underneath that even you don't fully recognize yet. This is deeply disorienting because the persona was never entirely a lie. It got you through school and jobs and relationships. It kept you safe. But Jung observed that a moment comes when the persona becomes a cage rather than a tool, and the psyche, in its push toward wholeness, simply refuses to keep performing. You're not becoming fake when this happens. You're becoming unable to be fake, maybe for the first time in your life. The fifth sign is that your relationships begin to reorganize themselves. Some connections that felt solid suddenly feel hollow. Conversations that used to flow now feel like they're happening across a growing distance. You look at people you've known for years and realize the thing that bonded you was a shared version of who you used to be, and that version is dissolving. Meanwhile, you find yourself drawn to new people, or drawn back to someone you drifted from, feeling an unexpected resonance you can't quite explain. This shift can be painful because it isn't always mutual. As you change, the relationships built entirely on the old you start to strain. People who were comfortable with your compliance notice you're less available for it. Friendships sustained by mutual performance wobble when one person stops performing, and you begin to sense, uncomfortably, which of your connections were built on who you genuinely are and which were built on the role you played. Jung recognized this reorganization as an inevitable part of transformation. When the self at the center of your relationships changes, the whole system around it has to recalibrate. Some bonds deepen, revealing they were rooted in something real. Others fall away, revealing they were rooted in the arrangement rather than in you. Neither outcome is a failure. It's the relational world sorting itself according to a truer version of who you're becoming. The hardest part is resisting the urge to force everything back into place, to over-explain yourself, to shrink again so the old dynamics can resume. But you can't unchange to keep people comfortable. The relationships meant to travel with you into the next chapter will make the crossing. The ones that can't were only ever built for the person you no longer are. If you're recognizing yourself in these signs, if you feel that static building, that sense that the life you're living has grown too small for whatever's stirring underneath, you might find real footing in the reflection exercises from our guide, True Self-Discovery. It's 24 practices built around Jung's approach to exactly this kind of threshold, designed to help you listen to what's trying to come through instead of drowning it out or running from it. The link is right below this video. And now let's keep going, because the next signs are where the shift stops being something happening to you and starts becoming something you can feel taking shape. The sixth sign is that meaningful coincidences start multiplying. You think of someone and they call an hour later. A phrase you've never heard shows up 3 times in a single day, from 3 unrelated sources. A book falls off a shelf and opens to the exact passage you needed. You keep encountering the same idea, the same name, the same strange nudge, until the coincidences pile up past the point where you can comfortably call them random. Jung had a name for this. He called it synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that carry a significance beyond ordinary cause and effect. He noticed that these clusters tended to appear during periods of intense psychological transition, as though the inner and outer worlds were briefly moving in step. He wasn't claiming magic. He was describing a pattern he observed too many times to dismiss. When the psyche is reorganizing at a deep level, the world outside seems to echo the change. Whether you experience these moments as coincidence or as something more, their effect is real. They create a sense that you're being pointed somewhere, that the shift underway isn't arbitrary, that there's a thread running through the disruption, and if you follow the strange little signals, they lead in a coherent direction. People in the middle of this often describe feeling, for the first time in years, that life is speaking to them. Jung would caution you not to get lost in interpreting every sign, not to turn synchronicity into superstition, but he'd also tell you not to ignore it. When these coincidences start accumulating, they're worth paying attention to, because they tend to cluster around exactly the doors you're meant to walk through. The world isn't usually this talkative. When it starts talking, something is moving. The seventh sign is a restlessness your body feels before your mind can name it. Something physical stirs before you understand any of this consciously. You can't sit still the way you used to. You feel a low-grade agitation, an itch under the skin, a sense that you should be somewhere other than where you are. Sleep changes. You wake at odd hours with your heart going, not from a nightmare, just from a nameless urgency. The familiar walls of your routine start to feel less like shelter and more like a room that's shrinking. This is the body registering the shift before the intellect catches up. Jung placed enormous weight on the wisdom of the instinctual layer of the psyche, the part of us older than language, closer to the animal, that knows things the conscious mind hasn't articulated yet. When a change is coming, this deeper layer feels it first and expresses it as bodily restlessness, a kind of migratory instinct with nowhere yet to go. People often try to numb this feeling. They fill the restlessness with distraction, food, scrolling, overwork, anything to quiet the sense that they're supposed to be moving. But the restlessness isn't a flaw in your nervous system. It's information. Your body has picked up that the ground beneath your current life is no longer stable, and it's urging you to prepare, to gather yourself, to be ready to move when the direction reveals itself. Jung would tell you to listen to it rather than sedate it, not to act rashly. The restlessness rarely knows exactly where it's headed at first, but to honor it as a genuine signal. The agitation you feel is your oldest intelligence trying to get your attention. It knows the season is turning long before your calendar does. The eighth sign is that you catch a stranger looking back at you in the mirror. Your tastes start changing. Things you cared about intensely lose their grip, and things you never noticed begin to pull at you. Your values shift underneath you. People you admired look different now. Opinions you held for decades loosen. And sometimes you'll glance at your own reflection and feel, for just a second, that you're looking at someone you're still being introduced to, familiar and unfamiliar at once. This is the most disorienting sign of all, and also the most important. Jung believed that beneath the constructed identity of the ego lies the self, the deeper, more complete center of who you actually are. And when the ego's structure weakens, the self begins to exert its influence, surfacing preferences and values and instincts that were buried beneath years of conditioning. Meeting that person feels foreign precisely because you've spent your whole life being someone assembled from expectations and survival strategies. The one underneath all that construction is a stranger you were always meant to become. It's easy to panic here. When you no longer recognize your own reactions, when the person you've been for 40 years starts to feel like a costume, the ego reads it as a threat and screams for you to grab something solid and hold on. Many people do exactly that. They retreat into the old identity, forcing the mask back over a face that's already changing, and they spend the rest of their lives with a quiet ache, the sense that they met someone true for a moment and turned away. But if you can tolerate the strangeness, if you can let yourself get acquainted with whoever is emerging instead of demanding they conform to who you were, something remarkable happens. The stranger in the mirror slowly becomes home. Jung watched it happen again and again. The disorientation of not knowing yourself is the necessary passage into knowing yourself for real, maybe for the first time. So what do you do if you recognize several of these signs at once? The instinct, and it's a powerful one, is to treat the whole thing as a problem to be solved, to find the fastest route back to normal, to reassemble the life that's coming apart and pretend the signals never came. Jung watched countless people take that route, and he grieved every one of them, because they mistook the beginning of their becoming for the end of their stability. The signs aren't warnings that something is going wrong. They're the early crackle of a station coming into range, the quiet where meaning used to be, the pull into solitude, the flood of dreams and old feelings, the mask that won't stay on, the relationships rearranging, the coincidences, the restlessness, the stranger in the glass. Read separately, each one looks like a symptom. Read together, they spell out a single message. The frequency you've been living on is fading because a truer one is arriving. Jung called the larger passage individuation, and he never once described it as easy. He was too honest for that. He knew this threshold was disorienting, that the space between who you were and who you're becoming is the loneliest ground a person can stand on. But he also knew, with the certainty of someone who'd watched it unfold in hundreds of lives and in his own, that the chapter waiting on the other side carried a quality of realness the old life never had. Because the old life was built from accommodation and inheritance and fear. What comes next is built from a genuine encounter with yourself. And here's the part worth holding on to. The very fact that these signs are appearing means your psyche has decided you're ready. It doesn't dismantle a structure it can't rebuild. The disturbance you're feeling isn't evidence that you're too fragile for what's coming. It's evidence that something in you is strong enough to let the old form dissolve and trust that a new one will take shape. The shift wouldn't be starting if you couldn't survive the crossing. So don't ignore the signs. Don't rush to silence them or explain them away or flee back into a life you've already outgrown. Stay in the static a little longer than feels comfortable. Let the old station fade, and keep listening, because what's tuning in underneath the noise is more real than anything you've heard before. A version of your life that isn't borrowed, isn't performed, isn't built to please anyone, but shaped from who you actually are. It's coming in, slowly, unmistakably. It's coming in clear. If you haven't yet, take a look at our guide, True Self-Discovery. 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's work, built for exactly the kind of threshold you might be standing on right now. A way to start hearing the new signal instead of clinging to the fading one. The link is right below this video.